the end of the fifth week of the legislative session, 2017 legislative session, is now behind us. There were a variety of big topics that we tackled this week, but as is the case for the last 4 weeks, the topic du jour, or the topic of the week, is the fact that we don't have any money to fund our core services like education, healthcare, public safety, and transportation. And while we're 5 weeks into session and only essentially a week and a half away from our House deadline week, there has been no significant revenue streams brought before the Oklahoma House of Representatives in an attempt to fill a nearly $900 million budget hole. And matter of fact, it has been so bad, and the prospects apparently on behalf of the Republican majority are so dismal in terms of raising revenue that they issued a letter this week to most state agencies asking them to prepare for a 14.5% budget cut. Understand, these 14.5% budget cuts would be on the heels of, in many instances, already 40% budget cuts to core functions, core services of government, making departments like the Department of Human Services and the Department of Mental Health having to cut back significant programs that help many of the underserved and many Oklahomans who are on life's edge. For the Republican majority to simply tell our core services to prepare for the worst is a travesty. Our caucus is continuing to search for ways to raise over $1 billion worth of revenue. We've talked about gross production tax. We've talked about income tax restoration. We've talked about certain tax credits and exemptions. And the Republican majority continues to ignore us on those calls. And instead, they're asking our Department of Corrections and Public Safety and Transportation to just prepare for deeper cuts to already underfunded agencies, and that's unconscionable. And so we will continue to call for the House Republicans to lay out their plan. Governor Fallon's plan to balance the budget is on the backs of middle-class families, and it's opposed in a bipartisan way. It will not go anywhere in this legislative session. Lieutenant Governor, who opted to pick up and quit his job, he's offered up no budgetary plan whatsoever, and the House Republicans, being the body in which revenue measures are supposed to initiate, have yet to offer up any significant plan to fund state government, but instead have told our core services to prepare for the worst. And the voters of Oklahoma ought to be very, very concerned about what that portends for the future of things that we care about as citizens. I've said for the last number of weeks that there's been a crisis in this building. When you have multiple revenue failures, when you have a $900 million budget hole, and one party controlling every lever of government in the state of Oklahoma, and yet they can't come together around a proposal to balance that budget hole, whether it was in the off season, whether it was in the fall or the winter, or now especially while we're in session, they still have offered up no coherent plan to fund state government. There clearly is a leadership crisis. And to compound things, the teachers of Oklahoma who are underfunded and underpaid, their class sizes are too big, their resources are too low. They had their intelligence insulted this week when the House Republicans offered up a pay plan that would offer a $6,000 pay raise over the next 3 years with no funding mechanism whatsoever. Our caucus, many of our caucus, supported that measure because we have a way to fund it through gross production tax increases or through restoration of certain income tax cuts. We can fund it. And so if that's how they choose to increase teacher pay, our caucus will support that with the revenue that we put on the table to fund it. But the Republican majority continues to offer no revenue to not only fill a $900 million budget hole, but to find $52 million new dollars for a $1,000 teacher pay raise on top of a $50 million budget cut that came due to the revenue failure to public education just a few weeks ago. Leadership crisis, a crisis in honesty and integrity out of the Republican majority. You can call it what you like, but at the end of the day, the recourses are being borne by our citizens, by our kids in our public schools, and it's really a travesty. I think that to date, the folks in charge, the Republican majority, has refused to restore those gross production tax cuts that have seen us go from a $1.2 billion in gross production tax revenue down to $350 million, roughly, in gross production tax revenue for one particular reason. It's because the oil and gas industry is the most powerful industry in the world, let alone the state of Oklahoma, and they've refused to push back on those folks that help fund their campaigns and help put them in this building, even though at the end of the day it's the right thing. I mean, there was legislation that came out of the House today that would curtail the wind credit, which, by the way, wouldn't put one new dollar into this next year's budget. The bill that passed off the floor today, which reneges on Oklahoma's promise to a major industry in the state of Oklahoma and in the United States, wouldn't add one new dollar to the state budget. But you could tweak the gross production tax from 2 to 5% and bring in over $300 million into this year's budget to pay for teacher pay raises and to pay for our public schools and our hospitals and our correctional facilities. They choose not to do that. The only reason I can assume that they choose not to do that is for political reasons, because reality has set in, and it's time to restore those cuts. When you're talking about just when the public schools have been cut by almost 27% in the last, since 2008, that means you've got programs, gifted and talented programs, for example, in Middale Public Schools have been cut back. You have nutrition programs that become jeopardized. You have class sizes that grow. You have access to special needs resources that are dwindled. That's just in the public schools. Then you turn around and talk about with mental health and the Department of Human Services. You have well over 7,000 people on the developmentally disabled waiting list, desperately seeking services for their adult children with severe disabilities, needing access to services, and they can't get them because we can't afford to fund them. And so many of the most vulnerable in their state, whether it's senior citizens in nursing homes who've watched reimbursement rates drop, making life tougher for them, or whether it's kids in the public school system, our most vulnerable citizens are bearing the cost of the fiscally irresponsible management that this state has seen with the Republican majority and Governor Fallon and Lieutenant Governor Lamb over the last 6 years. When the oil and gas industry benefits from approximately 13 different credits and exemptions, and the wind industry gets 2, one of which has already been sunsetted, and the other one was going to be sunsetted today, it's disingenuous to say that the oil and gas industry doesn't get it. It's disingenuous to say anything other than the facts, which the oil and gas industry sees great benefit and protection from this legislature. And we're not, my caucus is not anti-oil and gas. We understand that the economic engine that they provide to the state of Oklahoma and the jobs that they provide, and so we're grateful for that. But we believe that if you're going to make the wind industry contribute to the budget, to help balance this budget, the oil and gas industry, which is the one that has benefited most from the gross production tax cuts over the last few years, then they too should give back to the coffers, because our public school kids deserve it. And unfortunately, the folks in charge would rather go after wind instead of oil and gas. Well, I will say this. The only proposal that the House Republicans have put forward is the cigarette tax. And my caucus has said that we would support it if it was part of an overall grand bargain that involved gross production taxes, that involved bringing our federal dollars home for health care, involved restoring some income tax cuts. So we have not said no there. However, we have said, and that's the only proposal that the House Republicans have legitimately offered up. I mean, they raised a fee yesterday on folks who own electric vehicles, which would raise less than $1 million into the budget. And that's not going to close a $900 million budget hole with any significant movement. So in terms of what the House Republicans have offered up, we've told them, we'll meet you halfway. We'll absolutely help you do the cigarette tax. Let's do the gross production tax. Let's do the income tax cuts, and they've just told us flatly no. Now, to your question, Governor Fallon has rolled out $1.1 billion worth of tax increases on things like doctor's visits, haircuts, dentists, pet grooming, and our caucus is absolutely opposed to those. The state of Oklahoma is not in the mess that we're in because my grandmother doesn't pay sales tax when she gets her hair cut. The state of Oklahoma is in the mess that it's in because the Governor Fallon and the Republican majority over the last 10 years have cut $1.5 billion worth of income taxes, and we believe restoring those income tax cuts on those folks who make well over $200,000 or $400,000 a year is the way to go, instead of raising them on the backs of working families. So we are willing to help. We've offered our help, but we won't help if it's going to involve raising taxes on middle-class families. If she wants to talk about a sales tax on services like oilfield services, which would bring in $31 million, we'll talk about that. But if it's a service that directly affects middle-class families, doctor's visits, haircuts, dental visits, things like that, our caucus is a no-go on it, because we don't believe that we don't believe that you cut taxes for the very well-off, you give tax credits for the most well-connected, wealthiest corporations in the world, and turn around and make up for those cuts by making middle-class families pay more. That's unconscionable and will receive no support from our caucus. Another issue that came up this week that frustrated members of our caucus was that the judicial system for years has been underfunded. Access to the courthouse has been a major issue for our members, and we think that instead of using the state general revenue funds to fund the courthouse and ensuring access to everybody, access to the courthouse for everybody, regardless of how much money you make. What we saw the House Republicans do this week was increase an enormous fee as a way which would in effect create another barrier for for working families to access the courthouse should they ever need to do that. That is the wrong way to fund justice in the state of Oklahoma. A pay-to-play system for the court system is the wrong way to fund it, because whether you're a pauper or a millionaire, you ought to be able to have the same access to the same justice in the state of Oklahoma. But what we're doing now is making it ever more expensive to access the courthouse, all so that they can cut taxes for their well-connected, well-to-do friends, and that is something that our caucus fundamentally opposes. My hope is that the state Senate will do what the Oklahoma House wouldn't do, which is to stand up and honor the will of the Oklahoma voters. When they decided to pass State Question 780, which was basically to reduce from a felony to a misdemeanor many possession drug crimes, not intent to distribute, not distribution drug crimes, but just possession of marijuana, things like that, said we need to start being smarter about how we incarcerate or don't incarcerate folks. We think the voters of Oklahoma did the right thing. But today, the Republican majority decided to roll back some of those protections. They said it was in the name of protecting children. I'll be honest with you. If anybody possesses drugs in a school zone today, regardless of this particular bill, it is illegal, and those children would be protected from that. But unfortunately, what's going to happen now is we're going to essentially add another felony back to the books, which is going to break up more families, and it's going to do more devastation financially and emotionally to our Oklahoma's children, and we just think it's the wrong approach. So we're calling upon the Senate, Republicans and Democrats, to come together and stand with the voters of Oklahoma and block that legislation in the Senate.